Shalom, 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 everybody. How y'all doing, man? Welcome back to Reading with SHILO. We early today. We are early today. We're gonna go ahead and get back into On the Real Side by Mr. Mel Watkins, man. Wait. On the Real Side by Mr. Mel Watkins. History of African American history. African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock. We are starting in chapter 10, man. We are on the downslope of the book. Chapter 10 is Literary Reflections of African American Humor, Depictions of Things Unseen. Depiction of Things Unseen. And it says Godfrey Cambridge and Raymond St. Jacques in Cotton Comes to Harlem. So it shouldn't be a long one tonight, man. It's just a quick couple of pages. 4 pages, I want to say. 1, 2, 3, 4 pages. 3.5 pages of section 1. So we're going to do section 1 right quick. Get this stuff out of the way. Make sure I don't step on that. We're going to get section 1 out the way, man, while we camping. So I can head back outside, make sure I'm outside for the fire and stuff. All right, but chapter 10. Chapter 10, section 1. That moonshine y'all had'll take care of everything. Just give it another hour to work and you'll be blind as a Baltimore alley. Trouble with you, said Bo, is you ignorant, you dumb. The inside of your head is all black, like the outside of urine. Is you by any chance alluding to me? I ain't alluding to that policeman over yonder. Lucky for you, he is over yonder. Else you wouldn't have been alluding at all. Rudolph Fisher, the conjure man, dies. A ready eye for human foible may have been Langston Hughes's greatest gift. His laughter did not pillar a victim. It only surrounded his targets with mirth that was affectionate and full of understanding, even when it took full note of mankind's tendency to err. Belai Jackson. You get a couple of preachers. The next step is to have a bunch of honky social workers. Next thing you know, they done fixed the streets, put in new sewers, built a new school, and raised the taxes. There goes the damn neighborhood. There goes the damn neighborhood. All right. Until the late 1960s, the vast majority of Americans were unaware of Black literature. Black writers' works were generally destined for obscurity, dismissed as special interest titles. Even when the mainstream took notice, those exposed to African American literature in which genuine humor was abundant were often predisposed towards finding angry protest tracks, thereby missing the humor. In 1952, for example, the Yale's Review's critic extolled the brooding, bitter tone of Rudolph Ellison's Invisible Man, but lumped it with other crude and over earnest works that had little or no humor. However, myopic it may now seem, the critic's reading of Ellison's is partially explained by the absence of precedent for humor in African American writing. Now, few early Black writers chose comedy as their principal mode of expression. At first glance, this avoidance seems peculiar, since intimate involvement with contradiction and chaos and chaos often leads to a heightened comic sensibility, and America's racial arrangements were among its most absurdly contradictory features. On the other hand, it is not so surprising considering the restrictions that pioneer African American writers faced. Foremost, among them is the fact that the earliest black writers were totally dependent on white-owned publishing outlets. See, non-blacks determined not only when their writing would appear in print, but also to the great extent the nature of the work published. Nonetheless, some black Americans had begun to switch from an essential oral expressive mode to a written one as early as the 18th century. The first poem attributed to African American was Lucy Terry's Bars Fight, circa 1786. And shortly afterward, poems by Jupiter Hammond and Phyllis Wheatley were published. Slave narratives constitute the earliest published prose, written or writing, and also date back to the mid 1700s. Now, no lengthy fiction by African Americans appeared until the mid 19th century publication of William Wells Brown's Clottle or President's Daughter in London of 1853, and Harriet Wilson's Our Nig or Sketches from the Life of a Free Black in 1859. From these floundering beginnings in antebellum America, African American literature evolved to produce poets such as Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Brooks, and Amari Baraka, essayists such as W.E.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin, and novelists such as Jean Toomer, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison, Ishmael Reed, and John Edgar Wideman. Now, slave autobiographies, as Henry Louis Gates notes in the Slave's Narratives, I wonder if that's the one I got. In the slave narratives, text and context constituted the most fully sustained beginnings of the Afro-American narrative tradition and became invaluable as premier or primary sources describing the texture, detail, and complex workings of slavery for the slave's viewpoint. But when they were written by former slaves, who were generally versed only in the rudiments of narrative techniques and their use was primarily political, both to delineate the excesses of master-slave relationships and to affirm the common humanity and intellectual capacities that persons of African descent shared with Europeans and Americans. So humor or satire was rare. The abolitionists who initially encouraged and published the narratives were interested in graphic descriptions of the evils of slavery. As James Olney writes in I Was Born, Slave Narratives, their status as autobiography and as literature when abolitionists invited an ex-slave to tell his story and subsequently sponsored the appearance of that story in print, they had certain clear expectations, well understood by themselves and well understood by the ex-slave too, about the proper content to be observed, the proper theme to be developed, and the proper form to be followed. Moreover, while humor may be, as George Meredith and other theorists had suggested, the ultimate civilizer, the perfect antidote for hubris, wrong-headedness, and pretension, it is also an outlet for sublimated aggression. It implicitly suggests an equality or even superiority that most abolitionists were unwilling to accept from blacks. Although they abhorred the institution of slavery, few perceived blacks as their equals. The peculiar institution may have been odious, but its victims were primarily seen as docile and dependent, like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom, worthy of support and sympathy, but nonetheless inferior. The poems of slaves such as Phyllis Wheatley and Jupiter Hammond, for example, were noticeably restrained, and as slaves, they were obviously not permitted to express negative or satirical attitudes about their plight. Like concert pianist Blind Tom, they were treated as prodigies, curiosities, or anomalies, and encouraged to extol the virtues of their position and mimic the somber, romantic sentiments of their non-black contemporaries. Even if an incipient African American with capable of writing in the manner of Jonathan Swift had surfaced, it is unlikely that white abolitionists would have encouraged scathing ridicule of their Southern brethren as New World yahoos. This is not to say that slave narratives did not relate numerous examples of humorous folk tales and encounters between masters and slaves. In fact, while many non Black interpretations of Black comical nature had been printed, slave autobiographies had, at least by the 19th century, begun providing the first written record of genuine African American humor. Except in rare instances, however, it is not in the literary execution, but in the powerful recollected detail of these autobiographies that the humor resides. For instance, the tale in which the slave Pompey induces his master to admit that he was not a noble lion but a jackass, see chapter 1, was related to in Peter Randolph's From Slave Cabin to Pulpit in Boston of 1855. Now, Gilbert Osofsky's Putting on Old Massa and Charlie H.'s Nicholas's essay, The Slave Narrative of the Parkeresque Mode and the Parkeresque Mode, are among sources that recount other humorous anecdotes found in the autobiographies of former slaves. They vary from the irreverent to the innocuous and reflect bondsmen's contempt for and resistance to slavery's debasement, their wit and subterfuge, as well as their prevailing folksway and superstitions. But as Nicholas's point out, although slave narratives share some features of picaresque satires, let's see what that word is. Let's see what that is. I didn't seen it twice, and I believe I mispronounced it twice. There are features of picaresque satires, such as Tom Jones and Candid, exaggerate innuendo, mistaken identity, and ridicule. Let's see what the word is in here. Picaresque. Let's see how we're gonna pronounce it and what it means. Picaresque. Picaresque.
Picaresque.
I was right. Picaresque. Meaning relating to an episodic style of fiction dealing with the adventures of a rough and dishonest but appealing hero. Picaresque.
Picaresque.
Picaresque. But as Nicholas points out, although the slave narrative shares some features of picaresque satire, such as Tom Jones and Candid, exaggeration, innuendo, mistaken identity, and ridicule, the slave narrative is rarely comic. Still, Osofsky observes ingenuity, deception, courage, and aggressive humor also parade the stories. The best of these narratives smoothly translate the slave's oral tradition to print and are spiced with examples of full humor and wit, which would be repeated and amplified in tales collected by folklorists well into the 20th century. Moreover, by the 19th century, autobiographies by slaves such as William Wells Brown and Frederick Douglass would move beyond the limits of conventional slave narratives. Instead of merely recounting humorous or satirical tales, they began displaying an ironic resonance of their own writing. Douglass as most critics and historians have confirmed, was an extraordinary man and an altogether exceptional writer. And his prose, although basically polemical in nature, was not without irony and other humorous narrative devices. African Americans did not assume any control over published works, either about them or by them, until the 19th century. The United States' first black newspaper, the Freedom's Journal, begun by John Rushworm, America's second black college graduate, and the Reverend Samuel Cornish, did not surface until 1827 in New York City. Under its new name, Rights of All, the newspaper initially published Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, the militant anti-slave tract written by David Walker, which, when published in pamphlet form as Walker's Appeal in 1829, proved too assertive for most white Americans and was denounced by pro and anti-slave factions. Excuse me. A reward of $1,000 was offered by Walker if dead, $10,000 if he was delivered alive to the South. Several dozen more independent black newspapers emerged before the Civil War, and among them the North Star, edited by Frederick Douglass. The emergence of black newspapers in antebellum America, however, did not lead to the upsurge of humorous writing by black journalists, comparable to that found of the white press. In effect, black writers restricted themselves, choosing to focus on abolishing human bondage and selecting polemics and moral persuasion as their means of expression. Now, journalists usually adopted a grave or sober tone, simultaneously attacking pro slavery arguments and attempting to demonstrate that African Americans were not the irresponsible, frivolous souls portrayed in minstrelsy, Southern mythology, and the growing number of comic, fictional tales of Black life. From the outset, then the form of African American writing was significantly influenced by Blacks' reaction to the larger society's stereotypical views. This reflexive or reactionary tendency, largely dominated by Black journalism, was well as other forms of African American writing until the 20s and the Harlem Renaissance. Such mid 19th century novels as William Wells Brown's Clotel and Martin Delany's Uncompleted Blake, or The Huts of America in 1859, were fashioned after Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and crudely followed its melodramatic excesses. Now, although loosely structured around the life of its heroine, the supposed mulatto daughter of President Thomas Jefferson, Clotel is basically a series of vignettes demonstrating the barbarity of slavery. Still, there is some comedy when Brown relates tales of the shams and deceptions slaves used to escape or avoid punishment. And although it is heavy handed, Brown's portrait of the wholesale uh, miscegenation that occurred during slave is ironic, especially, let's see what that word is, miscegenation. 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 MISC. Miscegenation.
Miscegenation.
Miscegenation. I guess it's like misogyny. Sexual relationship or reproduction between people of different ethnicity groups or ethnic groups, especially when one of them is white. Miscegenation. And although it is heavy handed, Brown's portrait of the wholesale sexual relationship or the wholesale reproduction between different ethnic groups, especially whites, that occurred during slavery is ironic, or the miscegenation that occurred during slavery is ironic, especially when he depicts instances in which even whites were powerless to prevent their own slightly tainted relatives from being sold into slavery and prostitution. There are also a few examples of what may be the first use of satirical slave folk rhymes in American fiction. At one point, when a master has his slave step forward to show a visitor how contented they are, Jack, the most witty slave on the farm, offers the following toast: the big bees fly high, the little bees make the honey. The black folks make the cotton, and the white folks get the money. On another occasion, Brown has two white characters overhear the slaves mourning the death of their master in song. Well, no more be roused by the blowing of his horn. Our backs no longer he will score. He no more will feed us cotton seeds and corn, for his reign of oppression now is o'er. He no more will hang our children on the tree to be ate by the carrion crow. He no longer will send our wives to Tennessee, for he's gone where the slaveholders go. Now, Brown's use of humor and satire in his novel, however, is spare, although a good writer with an eye for detail. He was so intent on contesting Southerners' idyllic view of slavery that he too often veered toward creating a transparent anti slave document. Delaney's Blake, the characters of which seem even more indebted to Harriet Beecher Stowe, is also so intently focused on offsetting myths about the benign nature of slavery that it succumbs to the pitfall, of creating a cast of entirely virtuous black characters who are pitted against evil white slaveholders. It differs from Uncle Tom's Cabin in that it is much more concerned with the slaves than with the white characters, and stretches the spirit of discontent and revolt in even the ordinary field hand. But it is also readily abandons plot and character to embrace polemics. And unlike Brown's Clotel, the dramatization of the struggle between right and wrong is seldom relieved by humor or satire. The point, however, is not to dismiss such work, but to note the extra literary influences that greatly shaped early black writings. It is remarkable that these writings, who had been forced super superstitious super let me see surreptitiously it is remarkable that these writers who had been forced surreptitiously to gain the rudimentary tools of literacy were able to produce books at all. Let's look that up. Surreptitiously. 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 Surreptitiously.
Surreptitiously.
That was correct. in a way that attempts to avoid notice or attention secretively, who had been forced in a way that attempts to avoid notice or attention to gain the rudimentary tools of literacy surreptitiously. Black poets were also initially pressured to address abolitionist issues, counter the ongoing dissemination of negative caricatures of African Americans by whites, or avoid writing about Black life altogether and turn to so called universal themes. 19th century poets such as George Moses Horton and Frances Ellen Harper also focused on anti slave themes. Now, Harper's The Slave Auction is among the best of the antebellum poems. By the turn of the century, Paul Laurence Dunbar, the first nationally recognized Black poet, had emerged. Dunbar preferred his standard English poems, and those works included some of the best poems written by early Black American writers. But his popularity was based primarily on dialect verse, compared to works by whites writing in Negro dialect, a trend that peaked during this period. His poems were less distorted. Some, like When Melinda Sings, are perfectly pitched and capture the vitality, joy, and humor of Black common folks better than most of the contemporaries. Now, fiddling man, just stop his fiddling. Lay his fiddle on the shelf. Mockingbird, quit trying to whistle, 'cause he just so shame himself. Folks are playing on the banjo, drops they fingers on the strings. Bless your soul for jits to move 'em when Melinda sings. Whether by choice or pressure from publishers, many of his poems mirrored characterizations common in the works of plantation tradition writers. The humor was most often derived from comical dialect voices, and Dunbar's fictional slave were prone to deliver such lines as, "Tell Marsh Lincoln to take his freedom back." Much of his popularity was derived from portraying blacks in the minstrel mode. White editors and readers expected it, and although he once remarked that being restricted to dialect poetry was like writing jingles in broken English, he continued to do so throughout his career. Some other pre-Harlem Renaissance poets, including George Marion McClellan and William Stanley Braithwaite, generally avoided by dialect and African American themes. Braithwaite, although some consider his romantic ivory tower approach passionless, was one of the best of the early Black poets. But he had no abiding interest in satire or humor as significant features of his work. At the end of the 19th century, with slavery no longer an issue and a small African American middle class emerging, Black fiction began to reflect the trends that would largely define it for the next half century. That is section 1 of chapter 10. I could finish up section 2. I could go into section 2, and I think I can finish it up before the hour is up. But I'm looking at the sun. I'm going to stop right there. We'll come back next time, man, with section 2, Literary Reflections. We're almost in the end of the book. It only has 13 chapters, so we only have, 3 chapters left, and the 4. Look, we're on the ass end of the book, man. We are on the ass end of the book. So we're going to keep pushing, man. One word at a time, one page at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time until we finish the book and on to the next one, man. And this has been section 1 of chapter 10 of On the Real Side by Mr. Mel Watkins. A History of African American Comedy from Slavery to Chris Rock. And I hope it was something that you could learn and grow from in the reading for today. And if it was, man, whether you can or can't, man, like, dislike, whatever, do something. Like the video, dislike the video, leave a comment about the video, any critiques about the video, man. Let me know what's going down with it. Let me know what's going down with you. Subscribe if you like it. Let's keep the channel growing. We're almost to 600 followers. And once we get to 600, man, I'm going to keep pushing to 1,000 subscribers. But until then, man, let's do what we got to do. Shalom, everybody. I hope y'all have a nice evening. And if I feel like it later, man, I'll come back and read section 2. You know, try to get into tonight. We'll see how it goes. We'll see how I'm feeling, man. But until then, shalom, everybody. Shalom.